Today, we are going to talk about the top 5 pedalboard mistakes we see people making and how you can avoid them. That's right, we've all been there. You're halfway through a brand new layout, half the cables are already installed, and you're about 2 hours out from finishing your brand new pedalboard when you realize you forgot your tuner. You didn't put it in your layout, and now you have to redo everything from the beginning. We want to avoid common problems when redoing our pedalboards. So today, we are going to talk about the top 5 and give you the tools to avoid them. First up, the layout. The first common mistake we see people making is rushing their layout. The last thing you want to do is make it halfway through your pedalboard and realize that you forgot your tuner. So what we want to do here is write out all of the pedals you plan on using, double check, and then write out all of the power taps you have available on your isolated power supply. From there, match them up to make sure that you have all your pedals, all the power taps, there is enough power to power your pedals, and then move on to the next thing on the list. This is a crucial step in making sure that you don't make a rookie error right at the beginning of the process that you'll only realize once you're almost finished. After that, think of your feet. You might be thinking, I didn't know I was watching that kind of video, and you would be correct. What I mean by this is think about which foot you like to use for tap tempo, maybe hitting your volume or expression pedal, turning loops on and off or pedals on and off, and put those pedals down where it makes the most sense for how you like to use your pedalboard. The other thing, when doing a layout, there are plenty of great resources online to help you plan out the layout of your pedalboard. And these are great, and they allow you to see different positions of pedals. However, they are not entirely accurate. So use those as a guide only, not as a set layout that you're going to stick with. We have used these often in the past, and they're never 100% on point, so just be careful with that. Two other things here with layout is think about where you're going to plug your guitar in and your amp out. You want these to be easily accessible, and some people like these to be on the same side. Other people want guitar input on one, amp out on another, but just make sure you think this through as you're doing your layout. The other thing similar to this is make sure that you can actually update your pedals easily. There is nothing worse than trying to jam a USB in a tight spot on your board or having to rip the pedal off entirely to update it. So just think about this when you're doing your layout. Maybe put pedals on risers if they have USB jacks you need to access, but just make sure you can update your pedals frequently and often, and even that in itself will avoid a lot of issues in the future. The last thing when it comes to layouts is make sure when you're doing your final layout with your physical pedals, do it with jacks in. Plug your cables in and then lay them out. Don't forget DC jacks and MIDI as well. You'd be surprised how easy it is to misjudge this, and your layout is now taking up more room than you intended. Often this doesn't matter, but sometimes it means you're going outside of the bounds of your pedalboard and need to rethink your whole strategy. That is point number 1, do not rush your layout. This next point is one that you may disagree with. That's fine. However, I do believe it is very beneficial to future-proof your pedalboard. I can't tell you how many times a customer has said, I want to have this setup ready and I want to use it for the next 2 years minimum. I'll go around the world 6 times with this thing before I make a change. Next thing you know, 3 months later, Chase Bliss has come out with a new pedal and the whole plan has changed. So you need to think ahead. What are you most likely to change on your pedalboard, and have you allowed space around that pedal to make that happen? Even allowing space around a common overdrive to go up a box size so you can get a slightly bigger one without any issue is very beneficial. I don't think you need to do this for every pedal, but you'll know on your board which ones are most likely to change. Just think, if a manufacturer came out with my dream pedal, where would it go, and do I have the space to make that happen? Along the same lines is looping. You've heard of looping a guitar signal on your pedalboard where it records and plays back over and over again. I want to introduce another type of looping, and that is cable looping. As you'll see on this video example, this basically means when you're doing your cables, you go past the jack that you need to patch to and then loop back to the jack that you're using. This allows you to go from side mounted and then have the slack to go to top mounted on your pedal if it were to ever change. You can do this with MIDI, power, TRS, and future-proof your cables so you aren't stuck just an inch or two short of your destination if you have a pedal that you want to slot in that one's place. So make sure you think about looping and if you'll have the extra slack in your cables to make that happen. After that, we get to power. Do you have every single power tap on your board used up? Or if you wanted to add another pedal, do you have the power taps to facilitate that? Even if you don't think you can fit another pedal, what if you get one that needs 18 volts? Can you use a voltage doubler to provide 18 volts to that pedal? On the same lines with power, do you have the ability to plug in dual voltage? Maybe right now, with everything going on in the world, you aren't foreseeing any tours, but when things open up, are you going to be able to plug in 240 volts, 110, and 120 anywhere in the world? This isn't something you think you need until you do. So just make sure you get a power supply that can handle multiple voltage inputs. One that isn't thought about often ahead of times as well is your volume pedal. If you use one and you're using one that might break, maybe it uses a string or a gear that may break over time, you really want to think, what is going to happen if this breaks in the middle of a song? Do I have a plan to patch around it or to bypass it entirely? This is something you really want to think of ahead of time if you have a volume that is susceptible to this. And lastly, if you are going to use a setup with multiple amps, maybe you're running a stereo signal or you're running a wet-dry setup or wet-dry-wet, you really want to think, what if one of my amps dies in the middle of the set? With tube amps, this is actually quite likely. It doesn't mean it's going to happen every week, but tube amps by nature tend to blow tubes. And let's be honest, it doesn't happen at convenient times. So do you have a way to sum your stereo signal or reroute your dry signal to your one amp so you don't lose half of the signal that you rely on for that gig? This has all been about future-proofing. Point number 2, I know there are more things we could add here, but just think in 3 months' time, what are some likely events and how can I prepare for them? This next point is a little bit of a tricky one. Being someone that gives advice to people for a living on what they should do with their pedal boards and options they have at their fingertips, you might think that I want everyone to have a giant pedal board with every option available to them under the sun. It is simply not the case. I think some people really make use of big pedal boards and they have the time to learn each individual effect. I do also think though that you can overdo it and it takes away from the main reason that you're there, to play guitar. So all I'm going to say for this, option paralysis, don't put so many sound options, so many effects, overdrives, delays, and reverbs on your board that you never learn how to use them as musical tools. Really get real with yourself and think, what am I actually going to use? What is going to benefit my playing and not take away from it? The other thing with this is just make sure you have options where it counts. So I really like to think that having options around signal routing and making sure that you are ready for any venue type is a great place to invest options into. And it's really a safety, making sure that you're prepared for any scenario when it comes to routing. In general though, I do not think you need 3 or 4 of every type of effect. You need to tailor your pedal board to your needs and that will look different for everybody. Some people have big boards, some people will have very simple, straightforward boards that suit their exact needs. I hope I'm not driving this point home too hard, but just really think about this point practically and how it applies to you. Understanding your signal chain and how your pedal board has been put together is essential for knowing how to troubleshoot it. I remember a few years ago, we had a group of friends, we had our pedal boards out, and we basically wanted to see who was the best at troubleshooting a broken pedal board. So we had one person leave the room, the others would kind of mess around with it a little bit, maybe unplug a cable, unplug a power tap, and then the person came back in and they were on the stopwatch. They had to fix the pedal board as quickly as they possibly could. It seems a little silly looking back on it, but it was a ton of fun and I learned a lot. How do you fix a pedal board quickly? If you think about this practically, your pedal board rarely dies when you're at home just having a quick play. It's often in rehearsal and it's often in a gig where time is of the essence. So you need to know how to troubleshoot it quickly so you can get back to that screaming guitar solo. So understanding how to do this is essential to knowing how to troubleshoot it quickly. I could do a whole video on how to do this practically, but right now I will just say, make sure you understand your signal chain, label your cables, label each individual power tap and what pedal or pedals it's responsible for, and make sure you understand a bit about your MIDI so you know if you're getting some weird glitches that maybe it's MIDI or signal chain related. Think this stuff through practically. Lastly, if pedals die on your pedal board, do you have a plan for rerouting signal around them? It could be as simple as turning a loop off on your looper, or if your pedal is true bypass, you might just be able to turn it off and pass signal that way. There's a bunch of tips and tricks that you can think through on this, and the more I talk about this, the more I feel like we need to do a whole nother video on this entirely. Make sure you understand your signal chain, go nuts with the label machine, and you should be a whole lot closer to a quick and efficient troubleshooting of your board if that ever comes up. Point number 5 is a pretty simple one. Don't cheap out on the essentials. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people spend $500 on a delay, $300 on an overdrive, times that by 10 across the board, and then they get $5 patch leads and a wall wart for their power supply. No wonder they're getting extra noise in their rig and little gremlins throughout that they can't troubleshoot. Make sure that the things that are always used, your patch cables and your power supply, are top quality. This means that your board is only going to make noise when you want it to. Practically, this means get some patch cable with some good shielding on it and get an isolated power supply. You want to make sure that you have enough power taps to power all of your digital pedals and enough to make sure you don't run out of current for your other devices. Last thing you want is to be at your gig playing, lighting guy throws up the blinders and a whole bunch of noise rushes into your rig because you don't have shielded cables. Make sure you don't cheap out on the essentials. You'll thank me for it later. This has been the top 5 most common pedal board mistakes that we see here at Goodwood Audio. I know I've probably missed some, so put the revised list below. I'll give you a shout out if I see something that should have been on my list. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll see you next week.